Good morning. Rod Peppiatt from the Avenue Uniting Church in Blackburn, Victoria, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Welcome. Today I'm thinking about a story from Mark's Gospel, and my title, or my theme is, what did they see in him? What did they see in Jesus? The story comes from Mark chapter 6, two parts that are separated from verses 30 to 34 and then 53 to 56, and I'll talk a little bit about what comes in between in a moment. The disciples gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had seen and done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a huge crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And then picking up from verse 53. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. That's how Mark tells something of the story. What do you think they saw in Jesus? What was it about him that grabbed their attention? Was it just the miracle healings, do you think? Or something more? The reading from Mark's Gospel that we've just heard is less action-packed than some of Mark's other stories. In fact, the two parts of it that I read form, if you like, bookends to two of Mark's more well-known stories. The story of the loaves and the fish and the feeding of a great crowd, and Jesus walking on water. As I looked at that, I wondered what the creators of the lectionary, the guide to Bible that we often use in church, I wondered what they were trying to get us to explore. And I think it's this. I think it's stepping back a little bit from the miracle stories to reflect on what people saw in Jesus himself, rather than just his miracles. Clearly, the various healings and the other miraculous events attributed to Jesus were a very large part of what attracted the crowds. And it seems that this frustrated him quite a lot on some occasions. In John's Gospel, the story is told of the people who followed Jesus after he fed the crowd, and there he challenges them to listen to his words and message and to follow the way of God to which he's pointing, rather than just following him for the free food or the fancy shows. It's important to remember, I think, that Jesus never seemed interested in gathering followers just for the sake of it. He'd be no good today on Instagram or Facebook. But the point for him was always about raising up followers for his vision of the way of God. He was very clear that discipleship was about the faith of Jesus, not faith in him. Sounds two little words, but it's an important distinction. The faith of Jesus, his faith, rather than faith in him. So what did they see in him? Well, there's a couple of clues in these verses in Mark that might help us. Perhaps first of all, I think, they saw his compassion. We see his compassion for his disciples and his friends. The story picks up after Jesus had sent his disciples out to all the towns around to preach and teach and live the way of the message, if you like, of God's way. And here they've come back to him. They're all excited by what they've done and what they've seen and what they've experienced. And his response is to take them away somewhere quiet to rest, to eat and to process what they've experienced. I have a picture of him in my head, sort of sitting with his friends, sharing with their experiences, enjoying their successes, listening to their failures, helping them to understand what they'd done and helping them to learn. But as we know, his fame is spreading. His mission is starting to take off, and they're not left alone for long. As they step ashore, they're surrounded by the crowds, all clamouring for attention. And I don't know about you, but I think I might have been tempted to say, "Hey everyone, let's turn the boat round for a bit and go somewhere else." But Jesus doesn't. He's moved by compassion for the crowd because, as Mark puts it, they were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but it's very clear that Jesus sees not only their need, but also an openness to what he's about. Contrast this with the lack of interest and the hostility in Jesus' visit to Nazareth, told just a little earlier in the same chapter. Here, Jesus' response to the crowd is to spend time with them, to attend to their need, to learn from him, and their desire to hear what he has to say. And so they see his compassion. But there's more. There's always more, isn't there? They also see Jesus' faithfulness. And that's where as I mentioned before, the faith of Jesus becomes, I think, really important. Because we have to remember that Jesus lived and died as a faithful Jew. He wasn't the first Christian. Mark's gospel places Jesus firmly within the teaching traditions of his faith, but in a way that enables the law to find different expression through acts of compassion. I've believed for a long time that Jesus was absolutely committed to the law and challenged people to understand and practice it in ways that went beyond legalism. He seemed to say often, I think, if you can see within the law a way of excluding people from the love of God, then you do not understand what the law is about. For Jesus and the teachings of his people, I believe that keeping the commandments was more than about simple compliance and obedience to the letter of the law. It was about living their meaning and attending to the hope and the vision within them. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. And that, I'd suggest, was also what people saw in Jesus, that they didn't always see in the others who claimed to be representing the way of God. Then as now, us religious leaders don't always practice what we preach. Those around Jesus saw compassion and faithfulness interwoven in one person. And pretty quickly after he died, they began to name these things as not only the marks of a good and profound man, but as the marks of one in whom they had seen uniquely the way and the life of God revealed. And there's an irony in that in such awareness and naming, there began to be a shift away from the faith of Jesus to faith in Jesus. Ironic, because that was never his way. That was them. What about us? What do we see in him? I think it's a really important question to sit with regularly. What do I see in Jesus that makes me want to follow his way? I've thought about it quite a lot, and I've thought about it again as I prepared for this witness. So I've got a bit of a head start, I guess. But see if these things help you. For me, it's the storyteller who called people to imagine, to raise their eyes and see God among them. It's the preacher of the way of God revealed in the way of love. It's the poet who said crazy things like, "Blessed are those who mourn." And stuff like, "The kingdom of heaven is like a woman who loses a coin." What? It's the visionary so caught up in his faith that he was willing to die for it. It's the one who inspired those around him to imagine a world transformed. What do I see in Jesus? I see a heart for life, sacred life in the world that I call godly, a life of abundant grace and liberating hope. Now, I have to confess that last phrase probably sounded quite nice, but it wasn't mine. Abundant grace and liberating hope was the theme of the Uniting Church Assembly meeting in 2018, which I attended. And it's a phrase which has stayed with me ever since as a great image of the way and faith of Jesus. As a side note, as I looked at it during that meeting 6 years ago, I realised something. The word liberating in that context could be an adjective or a verb. It could be hope, which is liberating, but it could also be part of our calling to liberate hope, to set it free in the world. What does that look like? And that too has stayed with me in the years since then. But what catches your imagination about Jesus? What do you see in him that continues to inspire you? Many of us have been Christians or followers of Jesus' way for a long time. And perhaps we remember what it was that had attracted us and grabbed our attention years ago. I wonder if it's the same thing, or has it changed? What is it that makes Jesus still a compelling figure for you, if that's the case? Particular story? Particular characteristic? Something he said or did? I wonder. And as I wonder, I encourage you to not only think about it, but talk about it with someone else sometime soon, if you get the chance. Don't worry if it sounds theological or not, or if you're not sure about the words or feel you might say the wrong thing. If your answer is more like a question, then talk about it with one of your fellow travellers. Ask it. If I've given you something to think about it together. Each time I stand up to share my witness to the Word, I'm aware of how much wisdom is in the room, drawn from lots of faithful experience. I reckon it's a shame when we waste that. What I love about my faith is that there's always room to discover and grow something else. And that's enough to inspire me, encourage me, and challenge me to go on following that way as best I can. And I dare to hope that what we hear, remember, and share today will encourage each of us in the act of living his way, together and apart. Blessings. Amen.